Thank you, listeners, for joining us today on Ask the Expert. My name is Nathan McDonald of Sprott Money News, and we are very excited to have the pleasure of speaking with Jim Sinclair today. Jim Sinclair is the CEO of Tanzania Royalty Exploration. He was recently made chairman of the advisory board for the Singapore Precious Metals Exchange. Jim has also authored numerous magazine articles and 3 books dealing with precious metals, trading strategies, and geopolitical events, and the relationship to world economics and the markets. In January 2003, he launched jsmindset.com, which now hosts his gold commentary and is intended as a free service to the gold community. With this, I am pleased to welcome Jim Sinclair. Hello, Jim.
Hello, and thank you.
Thanks, Jim. Recently, there's a topic that has come up, and it's a big concern to our listeners. It's the U.S. debt. Washington once again showed it is completely incapable of tackling this problem in a responsible manner. Do you foresee the government ever resolving the issue of the U.S. debt? Do you believe the deadline for the next debt ceiling limit raise will be met with similar problems to that which we recently have seen?
To assume that the government would find a solution for the debt problem would require that both parties sincerely gave up a great deal of what is dear to each of the persuasions and got down to the hard discussions of what in fact can be spent, what in fact can be realized as revenue. It would require a degree of maturity and patriotism that we haven't seen, at least in my lifetime or my business experience of 53 years. I don't believe that the distance between the recent event and February the 7th is going to be a period of time in which both the Democratic and Republican parties become enlightened in the best interest of the future of America, but it will once again be a caucus together on how to kick the can further down the road.
An interesting point you raised there was that there isn't enough patriotism. Do you believe this is lacking in our political leadership? Do you believe they're in for their own interest?
Well, the problem that we're in are the spending exceeding so much of income, the size of the debt, the use of quantitative easing, the continued hyperliquidity situation, which is an absolute reality. A hyperliquidity situation is the parent of hyperinflation. Has come from a lack of interest in what is best, but more interest in what the various persuasions of politics have as their agenda. I don't see anything changing that before February the 7th, 2014, the next date for the go-around on the debt problem.
So what is best for them isn't best for the American public?
What is best for them is not best for the world.
Agreed. Jim, can you envision a day when a Cyprus-style event occurs in Canada or the United States? Is this one of the reasons why you often warn people that they have to get out of the system?
Well, I've been on a bit of a mission traveling from area to area where readers have shown interest. I'll be speaking in Singapore and in Dubai to readers just on this subject. Our Canadian friends should know that bail-in is written directly into their budgetary papers and is very much a part of plans and procedures to come in the future. The bail-in exists in a white paper that was issued by the Bank of England and by the FDIC in the U.S., the same paper. There's a white paper issued by the Bank for International Settlements, which recommends bail-in as a means of meeting any crises in illiquid financial institutions. Ms. Lagarde of the IMF has been extremely vocal in her support of bail-in as the means of supporting any difficulties within the financial system. The recent increase in the intensity of central banks, the U.S. Fed and the Central Bank of Europe, testing banks with a very hard approach, something different than existed before, is, in my opinion, the mechanism of bringing on bail-ins in certain institutions in a non-crisis environment. What I'm saying is that it is definitively coming down the road. It is written in document. It is hard fact. It's not speculation on my part. It's been promised to us by our financial leaders. It is structured and ready to be applied, and could be much sooner than expected. Bail-in was considered as something that might be applied to the banking system in 2016. I think it's something that could be applied to the banking system in 2014, 2015. Puts it right around the corner.
So you think basically it's just waiting to happen?
Well, I think that our listeners need to understand that when they make a deposit in a bank, they don't have an asset. They become an unsecured lender to the banking institution. That goes back to British law in the 1850s and present law in North America and elsewhere. In fact, it's universally accepted that once you make a deposit in the bank, you're lending the money to the bank. Now, when you hear that the bondholders and lenders will have to undertake the rescue of any banking institution that faces difficulty, to the listener, you are the lender. You are a lender without collateral. You are in a very junior financial position. And the effective amount that was withheld from depositors in Cyprus was 83%, if you consider that block deposits are not money. If you consider that exchanging your deposit for shares of a bankrupt banking institution, bad bank, let's call it, is by no matter of means money. You have to add all of those to what was taken straight off the top for a total of 83% of their accounts, which no longer exists as money to them. This is the risk that the listeners are taking.
So this seems to be a real problem with the fiat system that we're in and the fractional reserve banking that we've entered into. Basically, the money you put into the bank, it really isn't real money, is it?
Once you put the money into the bank, to you it's not. To you, you've lent your money to the bank, and the bank will multiply that in their loans, general business, and speculation.
So, Jim, do you believe that it's a plan of the Western governments around the world to trash the fiat currencies? Because to a sane person, that seems to be all the actions they're taking. That seems to be what they're doing. Or do you believe they're just oblivious to what they're doing?
Well, the question strikes me as being, is there a conspiracy? And if there is one, could it be the conspiracy of stupidity? And we become very self-serving in everything we do, especially in politics, without an eye towards what the impact is on the future, kicking the can of debt down the road, which is in fact kicking the can of solvency down the road. I think there's a huge disconnect between how government runs its affairs and what would be in the best interest, in the sovereign best interest, in the entire Western world. I'm not so sure that it's attached to a program to debase currencies, but as each individual currency attempts to protect itself in the trade relationships through interest rate policies and other currency policies, it's a beggar thy neighbor situation, which results in a race to the bottom between the currencies competing in this trade game and competing in the game of interest rates. The recent surprise drop in interest rates by the ECB, by Draghi, down to 1/4 of a point, has had effect on currencies. There is a very significant pushback against that with the accusations of attempted trade advantage. And it's again a reawakening. That's a reawakening of currency combat for trade reasons. So that's the mechanism which takes your fiat currencies lower. Now, whether that's in a planned event or the conspiracy of stupidity, I tend to think there's a little bit of both.
So regardless, the result's going to be the same.
Regardless, currencies are in a race to the bottom with that currency which depreciates the least appearing to be the strongest. In other words, no currency rise. They only fall at a lesser degree, creating the illusion of rising.
Jim, I've often heard you talk about currencies. What currencies, if any, I know you recommend precious metals, but for currencies, what would you recommend? Is there any currency better than the other, or are they all equally
Currency,
garbage?
currency is for transaction. Gold is for investment. That the choice now of any currency is the same thing as you're speculating on a tech stock as to which will rise faster than the other. There was a time when I would have said, sure, the Swiss franc and the Canadian dollar would, for various reasons, hold their position. But didn't I just say to you that bail-in is written into the Canadian budgetary papers in black and white? It's not a question of speculation. It's a question of hard fact. So the currency that you need now is the currency of your domicile for the purpose of spending, while the entity you need now, regardless of how the market looks at this instant moment, is gold for savings.
So Jim, you made a lot of great points there. A logical person would look at everything that you just said, the deteriorating economy, and be worried. Yet it seems that the average person on the street is completely oblivious to the dangers that we face. What's holding the system together? What's stopping them from seeing the truth?
Well, very, very intelligent, if you will, tricks. There are no bread lines because 47 million Americans use food stamps. If food stamps didn't exist, then there should be, if the people taking food stamps are legitimate individuals, 47 million U.S. people forming bread lines to be fed. Now, certainly there's a lot of abuse in that, but it still is a shocking fact that half of the American families are on the dole as to supplement their ability to purchase food requirements. The gross domestic product in the United States now includes research and development as an asset, and intellectual property as an asset. And because of that is rising towards 3%. But it's again smoke and mirrors, because research and development is an expense. It's not an asset. And intellectual assets are only developing in law in terms of their validity as in fact an asset. Can a new Twitter come up tomorrow to challenge the old Twitter? Well, the answer to that, through much discussion you've recently heard, is yes. So where is the intellectual asset that Twitter owns? And all the R&D that the company does is now considered in accounting to be a valid asset, when only a few months ago it was an expense. So there's been a great deal of adjustments made, pointed out probably best by Mr. Williams in his shadow statistics, where he goes back to the 1970s and assumes that to be the method of showing things such as gross domestic product. Back then it would have been gross national product, inflation rates. He locks in the formulas of the 1970s and inputs present information into it, and the listeners would be shocked to see that inflation in the United States, according to how it was determined in the 1970s, is running as double digit, and unemployment is running over 20%. These are the real numbers if you didn't massage and change the indices so that in some sense they may never show inflation again, or they'll show a significant gross domestic product when in fact it isn't true.
And I agree. He does a great job at looking at those numbers and putting them together. Another thing is, an example that we've recently had is McDonald's having to eliminate their dollar menu. Now it's the dollar plus menu. So there's examples of inflation. All that somebody has to do is go to the grocery store and do shopping for themselves and see that there's inflation. But it seems that people they don't want to believe it. They just don't want to. They want to believe in the fake numbers.
Well, it's been a long-term process. Actually, was started. The master of this process was Goebbels back in Nazi Germany. And what it says basically is that if you control news media, you actually control future economics and politics. And if the amount of voters that in fact do vote, are in the majority on the dole, then whoever doles out is elected. The chance of all of this changing without some sort of a critical set of circumstances is nil. But the critical set of circumstances cannot be ruled out. I would say it's gone from possible to probable.
So do you think I know you talked about this just previously, but do you believe that hyperinflation is what's needed?
Well, it's never advisable, and needed is a statement such as the horrible injections in the stomach you need to take if you're suspected of having rabies. You wonder at that point which is worse, the rabies or the injection in your stomach. So to say that something like that is needed, there will be an event that will make the public question their confidence in the system, and one could be bail-in, because most of the listeners have bank accounts. The idea that the FDIC has the financial capacity and is capitalized to cover all of the accounts under $250,000 if there was a systemic crisis is absolutely fallacious. They simply don't have 1% to cover. And the confidence that people have in things like the FDIC, the confidence people are gaining in the growth factors in the U.S. reaching towards 3%, when all that's been done is an expense has been transmuted into an asset, adding to the gross domestic product. The changes which have been made so clear by Mr. Williams in how the indices of the 1970s, if they were applied as they were applied in the 1970s to the present, would show crisis levels of unemployment, would show crisis levels of inflation. It would totally run counter to the mass media position that not only are things getting better, but they're getting better at an improving rate, which simply isn't true.
I agree with you, Jim. Hyperinflation is definitely nothing that anyone wants.
But hyperliquidity is hyperinflation. In other words, you say, let's, go dive into this great sea of semantics that inflation, deflation are. Somehow people have in their minds that inflation has to be attached to an ebullient business environment and be the product of a significant amount of demand and excessive supply, both for goods and services. That's not true. There's a thing called currency-induced cost-push inflation, which is what all hyperinflations are made out of. It's when the volatility in the currency creates dislocations in the distribution system that result in costs of goods and services, foods and fuels, drugs, necessaries to go up violently. There has never been a hyperinflation where there's been a good business environment. Hyperinflation is hyperliquidity translated into the price of goods and services. Once you have hyperliquidity, and the $4 trillion and more that we recently put into the system certainly qualifies. Once you have hyperliquidity, you are getting hyperinflation. And the only way to avoid it would be to reverse that liquid situation, which is politically impossible because of the delicate nature of the modest recovery we have in the West. Because of the delicate nature of the modest recovery we have in the West, you cannot get rid of the balance sheets of central banks, especially of the U.S. Fed. There is no exit plan, and there is no exit road. So you are on a path to hyperinflation that cannot and will not be dissuaded, taken off the path, corrected, made ineffective, because there's no way out of that balance sheet. Hyperliquidity is hyperinflation. It's only a question of time until that becomes an absolute and functional fact.
So you see no way that government's going to be able to change its course?
It's a rock and a hard place. The huge balance sheet that the Fed has now would have to be liquidated. And it's easy to buy $85 billion in a month, but try selling $20 billion in a month. It's always